The open source movement started as a way for people to share and collaborate on code. But over the last 2 decades, it's really evolved into a much more comprehensive stack of open data, the right to repair, and a sort of philosophical view that computing should be open and transparent. As we head towards Forward 50 this November, I'm going to have a conversation with Red Hat Chief Strategist Todd Wilson. We're going to spend some time talking about open source, not just as a movement, but also as a set of tools that public servants and organizations of all sizes can deploy to scale their computing out in a way that's transparent and accountable to everyone. So please join me in welcoming Red Hat Chief Strategist Todd Wilson. Hi, Todd. How you doing?
Hey, Alistair, doing great.
So Red Hat has been a player in the public sector for decades, partly because of the adoption of open source and how widespread that was through governments. Can you talk a little bit about the trajectory that companies have gone through and the public sector has gone through from the early days of open source, where it was sort of like, you need to roll up your hands and know Linux, to today when it's deployed at scale?
Sure. Yeah, there has been a remarkable transformation in the open source community and the way that software gets delivered. When you take a look at those early days, like you said, command line heroes rolling up their sleeves and geeking out at the command prompt, that's still going on and it's going strong. But now there is a much more holistic group in the open source world who are practitioners of all skill levels. And it pretty much has become the de facto way to get into the leading edge technology solutions, understand what trends are happening, and understand where things are going.
One of the things that I remember from the early days of setting up my own Linux servers was that, as you said, there was a lot of command line there, but it was very much machines, and then eventually that became virtual machines. And most of the on-demand platforms I see people using today aren't really machines. They're not really containers. They're sort of composed services and microservices. Maybe you can explain what that jargon means in a little bit more detail, but also talk about what a composed microservice looks like, and how does open source work when you're not just talking about the source code, but you're talking about the architecture?
Sure. So yeah, there's a lot of things to unpack there. And really, there's a couple of concepts that have evolved over the last little while that is making it easier for people to consume services and to approach very complex systems in sort of a, normal human kind of way. And so these are abstraction layers that have been sort of packaged together as a platform. And what that platform does is allows for a lot of the complexity to rest underneath the surface, so that you don't necessarily need to be an end-to-end expert in a particular technology in order to leverage its power. So there's examples like this when you're looking at, container platforms and Kubernetes, and there's very advanced capabilities under there that in order to deploy your application and take advantage of this, you don't necessarily need to know in depth how all of that works. You can use the abstraction layer of the platform and have all of that benefit without necessarily having all the expertise.
So Kubernetes is a word that everybody who works in cloud lives around, Docker, Kubernetes, some of these other terms. It can, to outsiders, sound like a zoo. I remember thinking about Hadoop. It literally, there's a thing called Zookeeper because there are so many projects named after animals. That makes it kind of daunting for someone who's in a management position to look at, because it really sounds like they're entering a world where everyone's got secret code words and secret handshakes and stuff. How does open source get past that moniker of everybody who understands it also speaks Klingon? You know what I mean?
Yeah. The cool kids club who understands that stuff. And this is where Red Hat comes in and really does have a strength in that corner. So Red Hat participates in those open source communities, contributes to them, helps guide the roadmap, and also helps harden and create, a more robust offering that the enterprise folks are looking for. So then if you're, your typical CIO looking at, these things, and it's like you said, the zoo or the alphabet of cool kids names, by leveraging what Red Hat has done with the open source upstream of those, the zoo, and packaged it into, long-lived releases, supported software offerings that allow customers to be able to rely on that expertise, again, without really having to have that deep knowledge of the entire open source history of something, basically like another abstraction layer.
Sean Boots, who's a fairly prominent writer and a member of the government in Canada, spent a bunch of time talking about the true cost of computing. And one of his arguments is that we fail to properly consider the sort of common off-the-shelf computing component, that there's this idea that you can just magically get some open source and it'll all just work. And I think what you just described is what's challenging about that, which is that there's a lot of hidden costs. How should people make budgets beforehand for IT projects? Because, there's this myth that, oh yeah, we can just get that for free, which is not true. How do people think about budgeting for this kind of stuff?
That's an excellent question. And you know what? I'm a big proponent of a learn by doing approach. And the benefit of being able to start with the open source community editions of some of these softwares is you can start really, really small for pretty much $0 and learn a ton. And then all of a sudden you have really good insights into what do I actually need? Where are my strengths? Where are my weaknesses? Where am I going to have to maybe get some consultants, hire some folks? What am I going to have to do in order to get this done? And you've been able to learn that in a very hands-on way with the software. And so that helps you sort of project out that picture, that budget, kind of a little more of that tactical plan of what is it going to take to run this, in production? What is it going to take to support it? What is it going to take to sort of start moving things around and leveraging some of these different features? So that, I've lived that experience myself when we started with a container platform in the early days in the province of British Columbia. We started with the open source version of Red Hat OpenShift. It was, free for us to download. We had it running on a couple machines, and we kept it that way for 6 months, while we learned about it. And we learned a ton. And it also helped us plan out how we were going to use this in production and how we were going to scale it.
What are the best kind of workloads to try out? What did you use to find out if it worked early on? Because you don't want to do something that's too ambitious because it'll fail, but you also don't want to do something trivial like a hello world because you want to actually find the edges. So what kind of workloads make sense?
Exactly. We took an approach where we were going to take what we called our Greenfield approach. So there's different ways that people try to tackle new technology. Sometimes they try to bring something old along and modernize it. We thought that would be very challenging because we were definitely in an apple and orange kind of world, moving from sort of legacy data center to containers and Kubernetes and OpenShift. So we found a partner in a ministry that had an application that they were working on, and they wanted to leverage a lot of the capabilities of this technology. And so we created a real working solution that was fully intended to go to production. And we did it on brand new technology that we didn't necessarily know was going to work. And so there were a few pivot points along the way where we had to make some adjustments. But I firmly believe unless you're actually solving a real problem and unless you're actually delivering a real solution, you're not going to tackle some of those real problems. And so by learning in that kind of real web app getting delivered, and we know that there's, executives in that ministry that expect it to go out the door. That was sort of the pressure for us to get over some of these roadblocks and some of these early humps. And so like any technology, right, there's all kinds of things that you need to adjust and tweak along the way. And if you don't have a little bit...
Did you have the previous version running alongside it so people could choose one or the other? Or was it just cut whole cloth and burn the bridges?
Yep, we doubled down, cut cloth and burned the bridges.
How did you convince the stakeholders who are risk averse to do that?
Luckily, we found a stakeholder that was less risk adverse than your normal public servant. So that was sort of key number one, is somebody that understood the risk. So the deputy or the assistant deputy minister that we were working with was a technologist and understood that new technologies sometimes are risky, and he was okay with that. The second thing is he also had faith that technology can work, right? You can make it work. At the end of the day, we know that we can make this stuff work. It's computers, they're things, it can go. The other thing that I think was a recipe for success in this was, we doubled down at a time when that team needed help. they were hitting a lot of roadblocks going down the traditional road, and there were a lot of dead ends in front of them. We presented an option to them that looked like a road to success, and so we were able to make sure that we were able to deliver on that success. So in a way, we were the option that was more favorable rather than the risky one.
So to unpack this, there's a lot of changes going on in the way that organizations of any size, not just public sector, deploy things. Once upon a time, it was sort of centralized versus decentralized, the client server movement. Excuse me. Then it was, client server versus cloud, or sort of centralized again, but in a distributed fashion. And I think today, most people would acknowledge that it's sort of cloud first. Unless you have a reason not to use a cloud, you should use some kind of cloud, whether you own the cloud yourself or you're using a third-party public cloud. I think what people don't really think about yet is what the pros and cons are and what the lock-in risks are for service models. Because when we had software, we knew what the license fee was, we knew what the switching costs were. We'd buy a CRM, we'd make sure we could leave with our data. But the problem was it wasn't that easy. Things weren't as portable as the vendor told you they were. Oh, yeah, sure, you can export all your data. But all the metadata, all the context, all the connections didn't work. You just wound up with a list of customers, for example. Can you explain to me what people need to think about in terms of lock-in and in terms of the sort of rent-taking tax that comes from proprietary stacks versus open source ones?
Absolutely. And I think, lock-in is kind of one of those boogeyman words out there that people really worry about. And to some degree, there is some bad behavior in the software industry, but for the most part, what ends up happening is sort of you do end up narrowing some of your options when you make technology choices. You decide to go one way. Well, there's going to be some other things that are no longer easy or cost effective, or you've made some decisions. I think one of the things that working with open source tools and working with open source community is those options remain much more wider open. So you have more choice as you move along. So for example, if you're using a public cloud, there's many services that are available there. When you look under the hood of some of those services, they're quite sticky, right? And once you get into them, you're pretty much going to be dedicated to that service, and you've lost a lot of flexibility and choice. We used to call that flypaper, right? Like you're there. When you're taking a look at tools that are, from the open source community, they're generally much more flexible by nature. If you're running an open source database on one cloud, it's the same on another. It's the same everywhere you go. And so that's where, containerized workloads have become very powerful for allowing folks to be able to move their workload to where the service makes sense. If there's a particular cloud that has, a chatbot that they want to use, they can use their containerized app in that cloud without a lot of friction. And so again, that's where, the BC government has been able to leverage that with their hybrid cloud model, and having that flexibility with, open source tools and hybrid cloud is a real game changer in that whole avoiding flypaper story.
So, chief strategist sounds like a pretty serious job. Things have changed a lot, even in the last 20 years, from data centers from client server to centralized data centers. Once upon a time, Netscape was going to destroy the internet and make Microsoft obsolete. That clearly hadn't happened. It's pretty hard to chart the course of these shifts, but there are shifts, right? Going from mainframe to client server to cloud computing. When you start to think about the future, how far out in front are you thinking about, and where do you think things are going? Like, what does your strategy brain tell you technology leaders and public servants should be thinking about where technology is headed in the next decade?
Yeah, I think, anybody who says they can look ahead and know what's going to happen is kidding themselves, right? It is moving extremely quickly now. And, I heard one quote that, change is faster now than it has ever been, and it will never be slower, right? So it's only going to keep accelerating. One of the things that I think, when I'm approaching, strategic conversations and people who are asking me, so how they should be preparing for their next move, or, looking a fiscal year or two ahead, is if you're not building change into your strategy and building pivot points and building, ways to, pull out a piece of technology or ways to work differently as an organization, change up what kind of staff you have. If you're not building that change in, you don't have a very good strategy, right? You're essentially doubling down on something and you're betting on one number on the roulette wheel and away you go. So that's, I think, where the key to success is right now.
I was talking to Paul Glover about some of the changes that shared services has made, and he underscored the idea that there's this new calculus that we used to make a calculus based on, like we'd focus on the cost and we'd focus on the schedule and so on, but we wouldn't really focus on execution. And now there's this new risk of inaction where you're going to be held to account when something takes years and it could have taken weeks. And a lot of executives don't really have a new calibration for that. He pointed out that, by being able to roll something back, pressing effectively the undo button, you can take a lot more risks because you can turn them off. How do you see organizations preparing for those changes? Like, I know there's the sort of chaos monkey theory of try and break things on your terms rather than waiting for them to break, because then at least you'll find out where the edges are. But how do you schedule as an organization or as a leader, how do you schedule the testing, like the continuous change yourself, like force yourself to change? Because that seems like a very open source thing. As you said, there's a tremendous variety of tools and much more customization when you can see the source code. How do you work the organization so that you're constantly changing just enough to keep yourself alive and aware?
Yep. Yeah, great question. And it's a challenge. What I would say in response to that is, when you're taking a look at the new calculus, like, what are you measuring, I think becomes a really key question. And because that's going to drive a lot of behavior. And so what I've seen successfully done, and again, this comes from my experience in the province of British Columbia, in the provincial government there, we started helping teams measure their time to value. The idea being that if you're always reducing that time to value, you're on the right track of doing something, right? You're getting more and it's taking less time, and you're able to make those adjustments more quickly. And like you said, that undo button becomes less painful because you're less invested in the sunk cost of a change. And so we've been seeing teams in the province, who are used to 2-year development cycles for their applications, able to put out fairly robust, purpose-built web apps in a few weeks. And so when you take 2 years and shrink it down to 2 weeks, the amount of risk management that you can, take right off the table, there's things that you don't even need to worry about anymore because you're only undoing 2 weeks, right? Like, there's not a lot of panic there. So I think that measuring time to value and making sure that everything that you're doing as an organization is helping reduce that ratio is a key to success.
One of the criticisms often leveled at the open source movement is the overly protected or overly distributed licensing. And obviously that happens in some cases with GPL versus Apache versus, is that still true? Or is that sort of Richard Stallman had some opinions and that's no longer the way the thing works?
I would say, last time I looked, the source of truth for me on open source licenses is GitHub. And so GitHub produces stats regularly on sort of the most popular licenses. And number 1 and number 2, which accounted for, I believe, more than 70% of the repositories that are currently active on GitHub were the MIT license and the Apache 2 license, both of which are extremely permissive, right? They're basically wide open licenses, please contribute if you can and have fun and do what you want to with the software is pretty much the byline of those 2 licenses. So I think that is a symptom of folks who were new to the open source community maybe 5-10 years ago, and were still used to a proprietary model when they were looking at open source, and were very worried about, well, if nobody contributes, then I'm not going to be happy. So I need to have that in my license that you have to contribute. And so a lot of these other licenses have started to fall to the wayside over time as the open source community has gotten more mature and also just a lot more flexible with what the software gets used for.
It does also seem, in the startup world, we're always worried about pollution, that if you use some code that contains open source, you'll be forced to give that code to everybody else, including your competitors. Seems like in the public sector, giving the code to other people is a good thing, right? I mean, when recently the COVID tracing app, people wanted to see the open source and they wanted to look the whole way down. If the COVID tracing thing had been built on something that was closed source or proprietary, you probably couldn't have convinced citizens that it was safe. So it does seem like the open source movement is incredibly well aligned with the public sector in general.
Absolutely. I think that, public trust, especially in digital services, is critical. And one of the root ways to accomplish that very easily is by having your source code be open, right? If there, is worry about AI algorithms that government are using, if they're open, you can recreate the behavior of that application yourself and check it out. If there's problems with things, you can expose them and talk to people about it. There's an exchange and a dialogue that comes along with these applications. So again, there is a public sector concept with a lot of information where you can get an FOI, Freedom of Information request, and get all kinds of great stuff from the government about how they work, what decisions they're making, and what services they're providing to the citizens. Why wouldn't your code naturally be part of that, is the way I look at it.
Yeah, when the Transport Canada minister handed off, normally there's a package or a binder they give them, the sort of transition package. And Transport Canada this year just decided or the most recent transition, just decided to create a website because anyone can go see. I mean, why not? Why should just the minister see what's effectively public property? One of the things that it fascinates me about open source. Hi, doggies. One of the great things about this modern world is that we get to see into one another's houses and lives. So it's fascinating to me that when people are trying to build machine learning models these days, the way in which we produce code has changed. We used to write some software, press a button, and it would generate data. And today, we're basically feeding data into a system, and it produces a model, which is effectively code. Putting on your strategist hat, thinking, I know this is a little further afield than just getting containers working at scale. How are we going to change when it's the data that generates the code, and how does that affect the open source movement?
It's a dramatic effect, because I think one of the biggest dangers that we have with data is assuming that the data quality is high, right? So again, it's back to the old adage, right? Garbage in, garbage out. And so if you're feeding your machine learning algorithms, bad data or skewed data, you're going to end up with bad outcomes. And those bad outcomes might not be obvious, or that data might not be obviously of poor quality. So to me, when I take a look at risk on the data front, I think not a lot of folks are really talking about that data quality issue. And I think that's something that is definitely top of mind from my perspective. And especially when you're looking at, what a developer can do about data quality, there's kind of still a naivete, I think, from a lot of developer groups that, all the data is good data.
So I know that when we're looking at open data, it's part of a stack that includes not only the open source code, but also tools like OpenStreetMaps or Common Crawl or Wikimedia or Open Corporates, where that data is sort of crowdsourced and in the public domain. Obviously, we want hardware that we can service and maintain ourselves, or sort of right to repair. Is the open source movement becoming broader than just the software code? And how should someone think about their stack being open, not just their software code being open?
Yeah, for sure. There is definitely a large-scale hardware, open movement as well, and open data movements. And so there is a whole stack in, you take a look at some of the IoT platforms that, rely on some open components, and where there is an opportunity for someone who is, like-minded and wants to make something from scratch. You can get motherboards that have open architectures and open source hardware components like cameras and microphones and things like that, and then start building stack right from the bottom up. what's interesting about that, again, is it starts to take off of the table some things that were very proprietary and very expensive, and democratizes that in a very interesting way. And when you start to see that happening, that's really the accelerator pedal for innovation, right? Rather than having these tools in the hands of a few, you're having these tools in the hands of thousands. And you take a look at what's happened with Raspberry Pi is a great example of that. Like the amount of innovation and ingenuity that has come from such a simple little tool is amazing.
Not sure if you want to answer this. If you don't, we can delete it and ask something else. But it seems like all the components in the world talk to one another, and key to open source into this model of composed services is APIs. There's been a lot of debate in the news lately about whether APIs are proprietary or whether they're open. But to a developer, an API is just how two things talk to one another. So how should a technology strategist think about the API roadmap and like the legendary model of, each microservice shouldn't need to talk to anybody else? Like if you have employees working on a storage container and a computing container and a content delivery container, those three containers or those three functions shouldn't need to talk to one another. They should be sort of microservices that are autonomous and could be replaceable. That's what gives you that agility. But when the APIs are not open, or there's a risk that you're going to be held beholden to an API, or it's going to be taxed, doesn't that sort of muzzle the ability for open source projects to scale?
Sure, it does, but I think there is a bit of a nuance there that you need. Like, not all APIs are equal, or nor are all APIs for the same reason. I think maybe off the top of my head, I'll pick up an analogy, right? So if APIs are doors in an office building, right? The front doors are open, great, but that doesn't mean every door in the building is unlocked, right? And the safe has a door on it too, but it's very locked, right? And only a few people have the combination to that. But you can still move freely around the building, take the elevator, do all sorts of cool things, talk to people in the cafeteria. There's a lot of doors that allow that. So I think when folks are designing their systems and designing their APIs, taking sort of a carte blanche approach to that, and either locking everything or saying nope, everything's going to be open. It's not really respecting the nuances of some doors need to be locked and some are better left open.
So, I mean, you're alluding to another complexity that happens with any kind of software architecture, which is that it's not just the code and the compute, it's also all the roles and the content and so on. Does Red Hat do stuff with sort of role-based authentication and managing these things? Like, obviously, there's wrappers around all these components that make them work at scale without having to build it all yourself. What kind of wrappers do you usually find people need around their open source stuff when you're delivering a solution?
Yeah, there's a couple of really innovative things that are going on right now. And so there is single sign-on has been a fairly normal thing that's been around for a while. One of the challenges with username and password style single sign-on is it's very difficult to verify that person is the person they say they are. We know that they have the right password, but we don't necessarily know that's them, right? Especially if you're using a random Gmail account that you generated yesterday. There is a movement that's part of the Linux Foundation now, which is called the Trust over IP framework. And so this is a verified digital identity movement. And what it is think of the way you carry your driver's license in your wallet. This would be the digital equivalent to that trusted source of information. When I look at your driver's license in physical form, I know it was issued by, you're in Quebec, province of Quebec. I can see the right emblem there and the hologram and your picture, and I know how that works. I trust it. And then I see your information. So I trust that information. That's something that's missing on the internet right now. And that's something that this Linux Foundation Trust over IP framework organization is working on. So it's very, very compelling technology. It's using a blockchain in the background so that the data can be verified and distributed. And it's being built into some traditional single sign-on tools that will allow developers to use the skills and abilities that they currently have with simple, OpenID Connect and OAuth connections, and have that tap into this new capability of verified credentials. So one of the use cases I've seen that was really interesting with privileged access to systems is, always a challenge when you're giving people administrator privileges. That means they can see everything, they can access everything, they can see all the data. And that's a big risk for a lot of folks. Depending on what happens with those credentials, there's your data breach right there in the username and password. By issuing a verified credential into a wallet and onto a blockchain, you can add another layer of security on top of that so that you can verify that the holder of that credential is actually the administrator. And it's very difficult to impersonate that. And so that alone is an interesting step that's evolving quickly. Red Hat is participating in that with the Red Hat single sign-on tool. And the Linux Foundation and the Trust over IP network is working together again with the province of British Columbia on that as well. So lots of interesting things going on there.
Wow. Okay, so to wrap it up, a very smart software engineer once told me you should always include at least one open source option in any RFP. When you look at the finalists, because it keeps everyone else honest. What do you think people who have modernization or digital government projects should do differently in their process of research and bid management to make sure that they avoid some of the pitfalls that you've alluded to and get to take advantage of some of these new emerging projects that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think, to me, not just involve open source in the solution, but actually make your solution open sourced, I think would be the ninja move I would make there. And so if you are creating open source, all of a sudden the folks that you're working with will behave in a very different way, right? It really levels the playing field. It creates a collaborative environment. So don't just consume open source, make open source.
That's a good rule. So Todd, you and I are going to be chatting on the morning of November 6th. Thank you so much for getting to a little more of the weeds around this stuff. It's absolutely fascinating. And as always, thank you for supporting Forward 50. Have a great day.
Thanks, Alistair. It's great chatting.